Hello, Exhibitionistas. Welcome to another episode of the podcast with me, your host, Joana Neves. Today, we have the OG format of Exhibitionistas. So if you're new here or if you've been distracted, we have segments now. So we have different types of episodes in this podcast. But we started the first season with one single format that is now called Exhibition Chinwag. And it was a very simple formula that was incredibly satisfying to record, and apparently you enjoyed as well, which is me, the dusty specialist, inviting a guest who doesn't work in the industry and who discusses an exhibition with me. Emily Harding was my co-host. She was the non-art specialist, the exhibition goer, as she called herself, during the whole of the first season. So today is the OG format, but I would say that today is the OG of the OG because my guest is precisely the one and only Emily Harding, back by popular demand, and this time we visited the exhibition together. Why visit the exhibition separately? So now is the time to tell you what exhibition we are going to talk about. If you haven't read the title of the episode, it can happen. Sometimes you're playing a podcast episode, then another one follows and you don't know. So we are going to talk about Emily Kam Kgnwarray, who is, or was, she passed away in 1996, an Aboriginal artist. And for that reason, precisely, I decided to invite someone from down under. John McDonald, an art critic from Australia, hopped into the episode and contributed with his side of the story, because I don't know John. We've never met in person. We've never talked beyond or before the episode, but I read a text of his on Substack, and it was the first article. I was investigating this episode, and it was the first article where I learned something beyond what everyone says about Emily Kgnwarray. For example, one of the first things that John says in his article is that he knows from a pretty reliable source that the spelling of Emily Kam Kgnwarray's name was changed by a linguist against the wishes of Emily Kam Kgnwarray. And he makes an interesting point, which is, can you imagine if you decided to spell Agnes Martin by replacing the I with a Y? You would not do that, but because she is from a very specific community, because she is not white, because she doesn't have power, that was changed against her will. The idea of this episode is precisely to empower you, my dear listener, and also ourselves, art professionals, and my guests, to enjoy exhibitions regardless of what we know about the artist, what we know about the exhibition, and also to then reevaluate the experience through the knowledge acquired across the episode. The knowledge is not to shatter the first impression. It is just an additional form of relating to the work, sometimes expanding the satisfaction, and other times providing an insight into certain issues regarding curating, for example, or institutional conditions of programming, for instance. The more you know, the more you enjoy. And also, if you lose a tiny bit of your innocence, I think you acquire something else, which is the expansion and the solidity of your experience. But it will always be a personal relation with whatever you know. In this episode, we are really going to be faced with that reality, because the three of us have very different relationships with this exhibition and with the artists. So it was really interesting to listen to John, and you can also check his page. He has a really interesting and very, very thought-provoking Substack page called, and I am checking as I am talking to you, Everything the Art World Doesn't Want You to Know. Another thing I wanted to tell you is, for you artists out there, particularly those who draw or whose practice is centered around drawing, there is a really interesting residency. So this is a shout out to Atelier des Arcs, which is in France, and they have a call for applications at the moment for a drawing research residency. So this is really interesting because in most residencies, you are there for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, you have to produce something. And so this particular residency is really interesting because it's a research residency. You do not have to produce anything. So the dates of the residency are from the 3rd to the 30th of September 2026. The deadline for applications is the 12th of December, midnight, Central European Time. But beware, the call is open to professional contemporary artists of all ages, but they have to be based or come from the Occitanie, Pyrenees, Mediterranean region. So if you subscribe to the newsletter already, you will have a link for the application there. If you want to go straight to the website, so it's Atelier, so Atelier, as you spell Atelier plural, D-E-S, Arc, ARQUES.com, and you will have on the residencies, I think, the call for applications. It's the first text that you see when you click on it. We will be talking about Emily Kam Kgnwarray's work. It's at Tate Modern, curated by Kelli Cole, and this is an exhibition that traveled from Australia, from the National Gallery of Australia, and that exhibition was curated by Kelli Cole, Warramungu and Luritja peoples, and Hetty Perkins, Harente and Kalkadoon peoples. So the exhibition is open until the 11th of January. One of the things you can do is to watch the podcast instead of listening to it on Spotify. So Spotify has video. I always do a video episode that you can listen to, so you don't have to watch it. You can just do the audio version. You can watch it on YouTube as well. And another thing you can do is subscribe to the newsletter, because usually I always post when, particularly for exhibitions Chinwag, I do a newsletter, but then I post another article only with images of the artist's work and with a little text accompanying it. So the last one was about Jenny Saville. So what I want to say about the work is that it is incredibly proliferous, and it starts with these very dense layers and overlayers of paintbrush dots. She had a very particular way of working, so she sat on the floor and she would hover over the canvas that wouldn't be stretched. So she would just work on the canvas almost as if she was working on a piece of fabric, a rectangular piece of fabric. But she was very precise about backgrounds. Sometimes she asked for the canvas to be prepared beforehand so that she could paint over it. And there are many, many variations of this very free use of the brush. There's a huge phase where there were these paintings with very sinuous lines, then with sinuous lines or these sorts of underlayers with shapes that could be quite curved, where you could also see paw prints, animals, little lizards, the emus, so the animals that were important for her culture. and that she communicated about. Then you have other works which are composite or groups of paintings on the wall, as usual with her work. And they are quite atmospheric, so they associate these areas of different colors that are applied with quite a lot of freedom, as always. So there's a lot more that I could say and that I could describe, but so that you know, there is this incredible freedom. It was always her hand guided her, the song she had in her. The paintings were very much related to singing and to women ceremonies. So the way the body was painted, so the body lines were painted from shoulder to shoulder, these sort of curved lines that would accompany the breasts, for example, all of those in some ways find themselves on the paintings, but they are completely reinterpreted. So you're not going to find the same motifs applied to canvases or the canvases seen as bodies. Actually, when you think about it, there's lines, there's dots, there's these shapes of colors. So the variation wouldn't seem to bring as much variety and as much invention as it does. If it's not the color, it's the shape that's going to bring something new. So it's quite exciting, incredibly warm. And when it's not warm, it's very emotional. So there's something always very vibrant in the paintings. Some of them are more subdued, but even those ones which are more in tones of brown, they are so dense. There's a density, there's an energy that is contained or released in the paintings. It's a very, very peculiar exhibition to be experienced, to be in front of her work and to stay with it. It was really an intriguing and thought-provoking and challenging in some ways experience to then think about the exhibition. Experiencing the exhibition was marvelous. And then, of course, thinking about all the intricacies and the complexities of what it means to bring a culture onto the Contemporary Art Museum, that's a whole other can of worms, if I may say so myself. I hope wherever you are, that you experience the exhibition vicariously through us. And if you have the opportunity to come to London or to see Emily Kam Kgnwarray's work in any other way, I hope you take that opportunity, seize it, because as far as I'm concerned, it is completely worthwhile. Now on with the episode. Thank you for sticking around, and thank you for being a faithful listener, and welcome if you are new here. Hello and welcome to Exhibition Chinwag, which is a segment that emulates the first season of the podcast, where Emily Harding and myself had really wonderful chats about solo exhibitions. And that's exactly what's going on today. And precisely with that person, Emily is back.
It's so good to be back. I'm great. Thank you. It was so nice to, be back in the habit of seeing a big show like this. And this is like, since doing the podcast more regularly, I feel like there has been sort of a missing link in my life in terms of, seeing art. So I've obviously seen bits and pieces here and there, but yeah, it was really lovely to go back and lovely to go with you, which we didn't normally do before. So
That's
shaking
it.
things up.
That's it. We completely changed the rules, because why visit exhibitions separately? There's so much to say about art anyway. It was a bit naive of me to think that we would exhaust the conversation right there and then.
Exactly. Well, you and me both.
Do you know that this segment is called Exhibition Chinwag? And you were the one who introduced me to the word Chinwag.
Ah, right. Nice. Huh.
Which still feels like something dirty and sexual to me. But okay. Something you would have to agree to with your partner.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm not, this word does not gel
Yeah.
with me, but
Yeah.
I find it so funny.
Would it require a safe word, something like that? Maybe. Yeah.
That's my feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. Good old Chinwag, good old natter, as they say here.
It's so good to have you back. So the exhibition we're going to talk about is Emily Kame Kgnwarray's exhibition at Tate Modern. Kgnwarray is an Aboriginal artist who passed away in 1996, so she is a 20th century artist. And we thought we could use a little bit of a perspective from down under. So John McDonald, our critic from Australia, from Sydney, is going to join us later because we felt that, and you're going to understand why, that we could use an input from someone who's over there. I think I wanted to also kind of give everyone who's listening a heads up. We are going to be very approximative with the philosophies behind the paintings because it's such a huge tradition. It's a different language, and I think they did that really well in the exhibition, where we are confronted with a lot of words that we don't know how to pronounce, and that was done on purpose. And it's a way of thinking and living the land that we can only kind of try to approach. So I thought of looking at the map of Aboriginal Australia first, because I think that's one of the things that I looked for first, to kind of have a sense of how many peoples were there, how were the First Nations distributed. And so I put it in our document there. Can you see it?
Yeah, yeah.
So it is quite different than the Australia map that we were used to seeing.
It is a phenomenal number of different regions and areas that represent different peoples. And the way that it kind of cuts across the continent of Australia is very different than the way you'd normally see it, but also very representative of her work, because she has lots of that section, big sections that represent different pieces of land and, kind of how different parts of the land join up to one another. So it felt a little bit representative of some of the work that she's doing.
Yeah, I'm really astonished with the number of peoples. So it looks like a quilt with very small bits that kind of make up the whole fabric of it. And so you have an incredible number of peoples, and you have all these little colors. It's very colorful. And you have all these names of communities that lived in specific areas of the whole continent. I was really taken by this map because I thought, I don't know a single word in here. And just to situate you, so Emily Kame Kgnwarray is from the Northern Territory, but not the bit that goes up to Darwin and then the coast. She's more from the inland, so the Sandover area of the Northern Territory, specifically Alalkere in the Sandover area of the Northern Territory. And she was born around 1910. We don't have a specific date. She then lived in a place called Utopia in the Northern Territory. And she passed away in Alice Springs, which is probably the biggest city in that area, on the 3rd of September of 1996. But there's also something that is really important to her, and that's why I wanted to have a look at the map, is that she is also part of the Anmatir Central Desert Region language group. One of the things that also defines a community is the language they speak. So this language goes across those different borders that you see in that Aboriginal map of Australia. I clearly saw two very distinct narratives coming up. So let's take the Tate. There's a video on the website in the presentation of the exhibition. There's Tate that always does these short films, and so the Tate film starts with a voice. We presume it's Emily talking about her way of life. And so she says that they lived behind windbreaks, sometimes in caves. They would make shelters with grass many years ago. So you have these views of the landscape. So the landscape of the Northern Territory is very orange, very dry. It's the bush, it really is kind of very specific landscape. And this is in the olden times. So the idea of the olden times is presented, and at second 27, so this is a 7.27 minute video, pops up this archival footage and this voice, this television voice saying Kgnwarray's work has broken record prices. Her work has, and I quote, become too costly for even big public galleries to acquire these days.
Emily Kam Kgnwarray set a new record for the arts, bring glimpses of the desert to the stark walls of the...
Emily Kam Kgnwarray was around 80 years old when she first put brush to canvas.
She lived on an isolated Central Australian community.
Artist of enormous distinction, one of the world's major artists, Emily Kgnwarray.
So it's immediately the greatness, 2.1 million is thrown at you.
Which is like the highest amount a woman has ever been paid for a piece of art. Is that right? Something like that?
Well, no, because in auction sales, you're not paid. That's sales between owners of work.
Sure.
So if it had been through her gallery, then she would have seen the money. But if it's in an auction sale, then it's a sort of it's the speculative side of the market.
Yeah.
Another thing that is said quite quickly is that she started painting at age 80. So she became a full-blown artist when most people are not only retired, but also kind of, leaving the space for the juniors,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're not starting their passion projects typically at 80. My mom is turning 80 in November, and who knows? I mean, maybe there's a painter in her that will blossom from this. But
I think she's going to start making installations with old CD-ROMs.
Or she could just kind of continue with her Tuesday card games and, kind of her normal course of, octogenarian life.
So then so the history then comes up, obviously. So the name Utopia, we're told, came from white settlers. It is quite a startling name. I thought, wow, Utopia.
Yeah, it's very specific. It has a very resonant it's a resonant word, Utopia. And I think especially for that area, it's like, as you were describing, like it's a desert, it's harsh, you're sleeping behind windbreaks and, it's not an easy life as we would imagine an easy life. And Utopia definitely chimes that, that meaning for us of like, oh, the easy life, it's beautiful. So I like the juxtaposition of it.
We learned that juxtaposition, and I think that's a great word, came from white settlers. So what happened is that Aboriginal communities settled there to find work and ended up, so this was a pastoral region. So you had cattle stations that were established by white settlers, and the Aboriginal communities stayed there, it is said in the video, for work. And so we learned that Kgnwarray worked there as a cattle, it is said also camel handler.
Yeah, I saw that too, actually. Yeah.
Listen, we don't know. Perhaps even minding the children of white families. We don't quite know. But it's kind of a hypothetical idea of what she may have done. And we also learned that she witnessed the fights for the Aboriginal rights to the land. And then we move on to what was the really pivotal moment in Kgnwarray's life, which was to find out about the batik technique with the group of women she was with as part of a women's education program. And that kind of, as I was saying to Emily before we started recording, there's a Portuguese expression, I have a flea behind my ear, which means a sort of a nagging impression of...
Bummer. You need to get some spray for that, girl.
So that kind of, I thought, education program, what does that mean and why? We're in the middle of Utopia. In 1988, Kgnwarray did her first painting on canvas called Emu Woman, which propelled her into the art scene. That painting was... it was seen, it was adored, and that marked a period into painting for her that allowed her to create for 8 years. So she produced about 3,000 works, more or less.
Yeah.
Give or take. right?
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, and that I just love the fact that there was a women's education program, because it's like, we were talking about before we started recording, kind of all of the differences that are taking place in terms of the US and values around the Smithsonian, etc.
Right.
And
Yeah. Trump's decision of,
part of what's been cut though is like US aid and kind of, those kind of development programs that would have had, that would have supported stuff like this. I mean, the British Council does it here. And, you look at what came from one of those programs, not that the point of it is to have somebody like Emily, whose artworks win lots and lots of money. That's not necessarily the point of it. But the fact that, it's generative of so much, and so much of the batik work in general, has come through those programs. And yeah, anyway. An aside to today's politics and how it's undermining the next Emily Kgnwarray.
and we have batik pieces in the exhibition, was quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
It is said in the exhibition that her works are centered around Ankara, the emu, so emu woman, or Aiwelie, which is a body paint, but also a term that more or less means women's ceremony. So this is the narrative, one way of looking at it, which is that there's an ancestral way of life. There's records breaking prices in auction sales. There's this announcement of the greatest Australian artist, who, by the way, started painting at 80 years old, and who, by the way, is a woman, which very uncommon thing. So a sort of a phenomenon that comes a bit ex nihilo into the art market and the, let's say, the art fields. She worked as an animal handler, started with batik, and she was inspired by body paint and is surrounded by a group of women, which to me is kind of what I gathered immediately when I went into the exhibition. Of course, I was a bit shocked with this idea that you could start an artistic career at 80, although she's not the first one, but as you were saying, exceptions exist, but that's not obviously the rule. So for me, it is a narrative that is a westernized cultural narrative, which is my culture. It's kind of the way I'm going to approach very naturally. If I don't second guess myself, I'm going to very naturally approach the narrative in this way. So we learned that locally, her work was discovered and minded by a few people.
Sorry, can I just about that kind of looking at her within a Western narrative? You wonder if Aboriginal cultures, maybe they were like, well, of course, you do the most important things when you're old in life. I mean, I'm totally unsurprised by my mom, having her regular, coffee clutch in the morning and her card games and things like that. That seems normal. But maybe, in that community, it's like, well, of course, you manifest all of your wisdom and you manifest your talents. And, it's not a slow roll down the hill. It's like a slow roll up a hill in a way, or I don't know, that's probably the wrong analogy, but you know what I mean. It's, you wonder in your script for the episode, you have those, bullet points of ancestral way of life and all the things that you just talked about. Worked as an animal handler, started with batik. The thing that really defines her work is that notion that she is in and of the land. That she is, even when she's making the works, she's sitting down on the land, and you get the sense that everything around her is being infused into it. And that is so different than aesthetics, which is the Western way of engaging with things. And she has, as I was kind of reading about her and looking at things, it just struck me as like, can a piece of art be wise? And I think her art can be wise because it's less about aesthetics and, I'm going to try it this way because I think the dots and the lines look interesting and this, but she is like transmitting knowledge through her work. This is a history book and a celebration, and it is so much more than aesthetics. I mean, before I didn't know anything really about her before the exhibition. And when you look at the adverts, you think Jackson Pollock, like that's not, and, I mean, I think a lot of people who don't know her might think, oh, this is sort of like, abstraction, what have you, expression. And she's figurative. That's what, I don't think I went in with a certain mindset thinking that it was going to be, wow, she's kind of like modern without having known about the school and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot to say about the painting, right? In terms of our own categories to talk about it. And we're getting there. So just to finish with this idea of the market. So there's a market for Aboriginal art that starts kind of coming up and becoming really established at the end of the 70s. And then from there on, Emily Kam Kgnwarray is not the only Aboriginal artist in the market, but she's definitely the special one. So, for example, collector and dealer Hank Eaves in a YouTube video says and describes her in those terms that I have just laid down. So, quote, she was a Stone Age nomad. She'd never sat in a car before she was 50. So that's kind of the vision he has of her. And then he tells the story of her grandson of hers that came to him because the grandson felt that Aboriginal artists were being exploited and he wanted someone trustworthy to take care of the work. And so Eaves recognized, obviously, Kgnwarray's name. And he said, okay, I'm going to look into this. He started dealing her work, but also others, and also collecting it. So there's this established market, and there's also this idea that the family that I wanted to introduce as well, that the family participates in this, and we're going to see how and why. So this is not a situation where the white person comes, takes the work, and then puts it in the museum. It's a more complex situation, and you very rightly pointed out to the women's program, and there's a lot to do with that. There's a role that it plays in there. And so he also says, and I'm quoting him, she's an artist with a pedigree of 40,000 years.
Yeah.
So the idea of the pedigree and the idea of the timelessness really brings home this notion that Aboriginal peoples don't have a history, they're static. And we have a progression, conversely, in not only in history, but also in contemporary, modern, classic, etc. art terms. And so he believes, Eaves, that, and he says this in the video, had she lived 100 years before, she'd have done exactly the same thing. So there's this idea that the Aboriginal person carries this truth or this aesthetic and just puts it out there. So this is really the Western narrative that is kind of doubled by a sort of praise for her modernity that is almost seen like a coincidence. So we have met through a sort of preference historically. And so the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 2022-2023 established or curated this exhibition called Affinities of Lewitt's later works. And when you look at them, they're real squiggles and kind of undulating lines with very different colors than what he started with in the beginning, which was no color, then primary colors. And here there's a real mix of very unexpected colors for Lewitt. And then the exhibition is in dialogue with a wall of en matière, so this language group artists, Kgnwarray and Gloria Tamere Petiare. And so there's this idea that there's a modernism and a sort of a dialogue going on in the work. And in the same museum, the way the artist is presented is, and I quote, as a leading figure in Eastern en matière ceremony. So that already tells us something. The ceremonial aspect is really important. Kgnwarray was also the artist in whose work many white Australians first felt the force of an Indigenous art that could be seen to negotiate a space both with the aesthetics of Western abstraction and the timeless precepts of Aboriginal cultural traditions. And again, we have this idea of timelessness and this idea of a resonance that is also a dialogue between both cultures. And she's also presented as having a strong relation to country. And thank you, Emily, because you did say that earlier on. And that is true. And the way it is described is again in Western terms. So there's the description of a work called Untitled Alalker, and maybe we'll get to the reason why it's called like this later on, from 1992. And the description is that it has been, quote, perceived as a lyrical mapping of country, a poeticizing of the desert in bloom, or simply as a spectacular abstract painting, unquote. And so in the Tate film, we also talk about thin boundaries between the worlds of the spiritual and the material in her work. And her work is explained as the way these two elements or planes interconnect or interrelate. And you can see that really well in the first room of the exhibition as you go in and you see the dotted paintings of the beginning. So pre-90, I think, where there's this sort of really strange effect of, like you say, Pollock from afar, but then you see it's just dots. And then you have, we were talking about it when we visited the exhibition, which there's layers and layers and layers of dots. And at a certain point, you feel like you're embedded in them. I don't know if did you have that feeling?
Yeah. No, I mean, it felt both like being embedded in it, like you can't see the wood through the trees, like you're really in something, but then also hovering above it, like when you kind of step back and look at some of the shapes.
They're almost an integral part of the dots, but at the same time, they're also an underlying layer. And you have lizards and geckos and these little animals embedded in them,
Emu
right?
prints, yeah.
Yes.
By the
exactly.
way, did you look up emus? Have you seen the emus?
Do you know I haven't?
They are the most adorable things. So they're one of the biggest birds in the world. Like they're the third biggest bird in the world, and they're flightless. So, I mean, and to me, like the notion of a flightless bird is just so endearing, It's like, we'll give you wings, but they're not going to be good for the good stuff, So they're enormous. They have these tiny little 6-inch wings that are basically just there to cool themselves off in the heat. But they have these really long legs and knees that are almost kind of right by their hips, so they could run up to 30 miles an hour. And they can take steps as big as like 9 feet in full stride, but their little faces are so cute. So I can see why she was enthralled. I'm feeling you, Emily, on that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is a really important bird for her, and we're going to see there's different elements for her that are really important. So another element of the exhibition, as soon as you get into the second room, you see an image of country, which for us is an image of the Northern Territory, where, so the central parts of the Northern Territory, where Emily Kame Kgnwarray grew up and lived. She moved a lot in that territory, by the way. That's why there's a reference of her nomadic ways. And some people do say that she moved quite a lot. But as you say, there's this idea and this notion that puzzled me a little bit, which was that very quickly it is introduced to you, and very well done, by the way, very well explained, that each painting is country and it is everything. She said often, this is everything. And so we were talking about how the paintings were the land, and there is no dissociation between country, land, and dreaming. So the dreaming or country. And they seem to, like you were saying, like you seem to be hovering above the land. And so very usefully so, you have images pasted onto the wall, these very massive expanses, photographic expanses of the land. So you have a sort of a direct equivalence between the paintings as expressions of that landscape. But Emily Kam Kgnwarray, I'm pretty sure she never took a plane or a helicopter. She's never seen it from above. So it's so interesting to see what kind of mapping is this?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I guess from those high points, she could have seen, quite a bit of the country, even if she hadn't been, in a plane or, kind of above it in that sense. I think, in her relationship to country, she's always looking down. She's not looking up. There's no references to sky that I can think of.
I saw some references to constellations and looking upwards in some texts that I read,
In the
but
exhibition.
that didn't come across in the exhibition.
Yeah, but I mean, and I thought that was interesting that, there is a very distinct relationship with the ground, with the underground, with the lay of the land. She's a landscape painter in some respects. Tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Continue.
Yeah, so absolutely. That's so true. There's a real kind of like lowering of onto the ground on in her paintings. So when we got out, we picked up a few books, and I bought this book called Songlines by Margot Neal and Lynn Kelly, The Power and Promise. And Margot Neal actually organized one of the first exhibitions of Emily Kam Kgnwarray in Queensland. So she describes a little bit what this Aboriginal set of beliefs and histories and relationships to land. And so she starts by saying, everything starts, and so I'm quoting here, everything starts and ends with country in the Aboriginal worldview. Yet there are no endings in this worldview, nor are there any beginnings. Time and place are infinite and everywhere. Everything is part of a continuum, an endless flow of life and ideas emanating from country, which some refer to as the dreaming. In the dreaming, as in country, there is no separation between the animate and inanimate. Everything is living, people, animals, plants, earth, water, and air. We speak of sea, land, and sky country. Creator ancestors created the country and its interface, the dreaming. In turn, dreaming speaks for country, which holds the law and knowledge. Country has dreaming. Country is dreaming. It is this oneness of all things that explains how and why Aboriginal knowledges belong to an integrated system of learning. And so later on, she says, country holds, so I'm quoting here again, country holds information, innovations, stories and secrets from medicine, engineering, ecology and astronomy to social mores on how to live and social organization, including moiety division and kinship systems. It is the wellspring from which all knowledge originates and gives rise to the expression, our history is written in the land. By history, we mean all knowledge, sciences, humanities, and ancestral knowledge, not only what is compartmentalized as Western history. If country holds all knowledge, then country is clever. And then she goes on to say, as our knowledge system encompasses a concept of time that talks of the enduring present and eternal time, the Western divisions of past, present, and future, or historical and contemporary, are not particularly relevant, though they are useful at times. This recycling of time is embodied in the expression, when you look behind you, you see the future in your footprints. And so here we have not really a notion of timelessness, but a different relationship with the very idea of history. This idea that everything comes from land, everything comes from country, but not just this sort of mystical relationship to country, but very specifically technical relationships and answers for problem solving, basically like engineering and ecological systems and knowledge of the country. So Lynn Kelly is really interesting because she explains that She didn't know anything about Aboriginal history. She complains that at school she was never taught Aboriginal history. And the idea that she had was that there was no history and there was no science. But when she finally had to study a particular kind of crocodile, I think, so she was looking at an animal, she went to her colleagues, tried to find out things about this species, and 10 or 12 were known. And the only people who actually knew 100 or more specimens and behaviors, etc., about the animal were the Aboriginal people.
I mean, I think that's so, looking at the work and the way that she worked, again, that sitting on the ground doing the work, it has a real meditative quality. You get the sense that she is someone who has been, even though she hasn't been painting until she was 80 years old, she had this deep observation that comes from actually really being in a place. When you are really in a place and you know it intimately, you see the various varieties of crocodiles, I mean, and that's just not, again, to your point of, the differences in approach and understanding and, defining what is, there's that very lab scientific, go out and find approach. And there's the live, observe, embodied approach that she seems to have with the work that she's done. Yeah.
And so one of the things that you learn in this book, and that's why it's called Songlines, is that there's a very clear articulation between the movement of making those sinuous lines, for example, and these lines are very close to the gestures of applying paint for the ceremonies, for the women's ceremonies. But there's also another aspect, which is the voice and the song. And so country is also song. And those lines and these paintings are also sung. And so sometimes, apparently, Emily Kam Kgnwarray was notoriously silent about the works. And so she didn't explain the work, but she would sometimes touch a painting and sing it.
I saw that. Yeah, that's so cool. And so it was hard to get names of any of the paintings out of her. So that's apparently why so many are called country, is just because she would just repeat that again and again. Country is what it is. Country is everything. Yeah. Although there were some great names like Wild Potato Dreaming. And there's like Bush Potato Dreaming, and
yeah,
the ones she did have were pretty choice.
We had a moment there with the Wild Potato Dreaming. We just kind of stood there, kind of like, wow, that's gorgeous. So her role was to learn its ancient history and all the physical characteristics, as well as responsibilities associated with maintaining the continuity of the land. So for her, these paintings are a transmission. And you use this word, and it's a very, very good one, because as we will see, there's really this relationship with communication with another side of the country and other people. So what we learn as well is that her people were forced to work for pastoralists. So she worked at Wood Green Station, looking after domestic animals, and also led camel trains, and even worked in a mine, the Wolfram mine, in return for rations. And so she was a ceremonial leader. She was also active, I learn in this text, in the land rights movement. And another question that I had was, why batik? What happened? Why were there only women? Well, so to go back, so the women's programs were built by someone who was there, who saw women waiting for the children when they went to school. And she thought, why not try and do something with them? And so they started by doing tie-dye, which was kind of this remnant of hippie culture. And the women took to these things. The women took to this culture and to these traditions because they had this practice, this artistic practice for ages. So they had this knowledge of mark making and line making and pattern making. And they loved tie-dye, but they loved batik even more, which is an Indonesian technique. And I was kind of baffled. Why batik?
Yeah, me too. Yeah. And it's really difficult, batik. I mean, it is not, I didn't really realize that the process of it was so involved. I think it's interesting that, her batiks, Emily's batiks, a lot of the same themes you can see, obviously, in the early paintings in particular, but just like from an aging perspective. It's like, you can see her age through her work. It's like that really, she did batik for 10 years before she started painting. And that's, you've got to stretch it across your legs, and then you've got to, make the marks, and then there's a whole process.
It's melted wax.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you have to build a fire.
Yeah.
To melt the wax.
And then, she moves to paint, and it's this really intensive process where you see all these little dots, and, that is, not easy either. It's like, that's reasonably laborious, less laborious than batik. But then you see her kind of move from dots to more of the sinuous lines of the, of the yam roots or what have you. And I just love the fact that, someone who is that expert at batik could think, man, this is too hard for me now. I'm old, and really kind of stick there, and be like, oh, I'm really going to grieve the fact that I can't do batik anymore. But she just plowed on. Like, this woman just moved forward with such force. I mean, she was obviously, as you said, 3,000 paintings in 8 years plus, probably even more than. But there was just no kind of hesitation. And it was like, oh, well, I can't do this anymore. Then I'll do this. Then I'll just push it to the next thing and see what works for me as a human being where I am right now. And I found that really inspiring as someone who just had their 50th birthday. It's like,
yes, happy birthday, Emily. Well, so in that story and in that real progression, so there's an aspect that this text kind of sheds light on, which is that all of these materials were brought to these women. So there's a group of women. First of all, this is communal. And the reason why the batik started being made was that this was also a way for the group of people, for this community, to be sustainable. So it was supposed to be marketed and sold, and for them to make money. And the way money was made was a person, one of the artists, would sell work, and then the money would arrive. It would be shown to everyone and shared amongst everyone. So Emily Kam Kgnwarray became this artist who was a provider, because Christopher Hodges, who had a gallery, I think Utopian Art Gallery is called, or Utopia Art Gallery, but he was also an artist. He explains that what was absolutely incredible is that you would have this shop with, a hodgepodge of things, then one of Emily Kam Kgnwarray's batiks, and connoisseurs, non-connoisseurs, people would be drawn to that batik. She really had a vibrant quality to her work, even, and we saw that in the exhibition, in the batik works. And so she started selling quite a bit, and she started being really, really successful. And so she moved on to painting. One of the reasons is basically what you were saying. She was tired, but she had stuff in her. Had to come out somehow. And so another thing, much so that in 1992, she received an Australian Arts Creative Fellowship, which is a huge recognition of her work as someone who brought an enormous contribution to the culture. For Emily, at the time, 1992 was, I had the Creative Fellowship, I was recognized, I'm a senior, now I want to pass on my knowledge to the youngsters. I want to retire. She was tired, but she couldn't do it because the demands of the community and the family never made this possible, because she was the great provider. There's no notion of the solitary genius. Time for a short break to let you into the Exhibitionistas studio. Look around you. There is a computer, a good mic, the software in the computer, which is a sort of virtual space through which you and I meet with a time and space delay. Then there are my books and 2 perfectly round Flintstones. All the magic happens here. I've been talking to a university whose students need placements, and I could use some assistance with production and research while also mentoring the future professionals of the field. And that's where you come in. Do you know how much a membership costs? A mere £25 a year, which means that you pay £2 a month. £25 for a whole year. When you buy a catalogue, that's the average price for one single book with 2 texts. If you become a member of Exhibitionistas through a platform called Substack, you not only get to support Exhibitionistas, but you also receive on average about 18 more texts minimum that I will have written about many, many, many fascinating topics of contemporary art, philosophy of art, and many other subjects. There's a little bonus that I added, which is getting to ask me questions. If you have a question about contemporary art, about the field, about the market, about studies in contemporary art, I'm very, very happy to do the research for you or to dig into my little well of knowledge and put the information out there for you. I can name you or you can be anonymous, so you get to put me to work as long as the questions and the prompts you give me are within my abilities. Otherwise, you can go to donor box in the description notes. If you have £1 to spare, you can just donate one time, very, very small amounts. That's what I do with Wikipedia. Once in a while, I put some money in there because I use it almost daily. And I want to reward people who nourish me. Thank you for spending some time with me here in my studio. Thank you for considering this decent proposal. On with the episode. We've never done this in Exhibitionistas, to have someone just popping in from down under and giving us a bit of context. But it's my pleasure to welcome John McDonald to the podcast. John is an art critic, has, I want to say, 4 decades of art criticism in there. Am I wrong in saying that?
Unfortunately, you're absolutely correct. It's sort of a bit shocking how long I've been doing it, but it is about 4 decades now. I've been writing about the visual arts now for about 4 decades. I was senior art critic for the Sydney Morning Herald at the age of 23, and I'm now in my early 60s. So it's been a long time. Most of that time, I wrote a weekly column for the Sydney Morning Herald. I was actually cancelled last year in rather kind of shocking circumstances, the way they did it, in a very, very sort of nasty way, as if they wanted me to just disappear off the planet. But the problem really was not that I was doing anything wrong. The problem was that I was doing my job, and I was criticising things, and I was taking things on, and I was looking for issues. I found that the last 3 years of writing, everything was getting messed around, and when I found myself out on my own, I started this website on Substack, which is called Everything the Art World Doesn't Want You to Know. And it's taken off like a rocket. So I can't really complain now. I feel as though it's been all to the good. So the Emily show, which I basically funded my own trip to London to see the show and write about it, has led to at least 3 pieces. And one of the reasons I wanted to see this show so badly and to write about it was I had seen all the other Emily shows. I saw and wrote about the shows in 1998, in 2008, and the one last year at the National Gallery in Canberra. And at the time, I was critical of the show in Canberra, not of the work itself, because I think that Emily Kam Kgnwarray is a great artist, and at her very best, she's fantastic. But it was the curatorial aspect of the show, the selection of works, the way it was done, and the fact that, an artist who really requires a little bit of thought when you're putting an exhibition like this together was done in a very pedestrian manner. So I said all these things, and I was quite explicit with the criticisms, even of the catalogue, which had enormous clangers in the catalogue, just to see whether or not the Tate, when they did the show the following year, would follow the NGA template, or whether they would do something different, whether they would at least correct the mistakes, whether they would think again about the selection of works. Because this particular selection remarkably leaves out Emily's biggest and some think her best work, which is Earth's Creation, a work shown in 2007 at the Venice Biennale by Kam Kgnwarray, and it was a sensation for a lot of people to see that big work all by itself in the Italian pavilion. That's most people's introduction to Emily, and weirdly, it wasn't in the show. The other works which are not in the show, which are absolute essentials, were the last work she did, which are a group of small works. There were about 24. Most of them are still in with the hands of one dealer, and they were omitted as well. Whereas the exhibition in 2008 in Osaka, which was everything. Osaka's a strange museum. It's almost underground. On the top level, you walked in and you were met with Earth's Creation, one big whopping painting, and all of the information you needed to know about Emily, about the Utopia community, all of the anthropological stuff, all of the things about the community, just giving you an introduction so you had the knowledge to take into that exhibition. Then when you went downstairs and you entered the exhibition, the first thing you saw were all of her last works. And it was really quite stunning because these works are very poignant.
Yeah, I read somewhere that the curators of the show still keep an Emily Day as a sort of a tradition because of the sensation that the exhibition was and the audiences that it brought into the museum. Is that true? Did you hear that?
No, it's perfectly true. Every year they keep an Emily Day as a memorial to that show. It was
Wow.
they would not have seen anything like it. I mean, even to curate an exhibition with Margot O'Neill must have been an incredible shock to the system, because if you know, Japanese people by nature are a very polite, very formal, whereas Margot is rather the opposite. Margot is, well, as we say in Australia, rough as guts.
Margot Neal is, wait, you're going to tell me if that's correct. She's an Australian author, historian and curator of Aboriginal and Irish descent and a Gumbaynggirran Ira Juri woman. And her Aboriginal name is Ngawa Gurawa. Emily, do you have any questions for John?
I mean, look, John, my role here is the novice, okay? So I am not in the art world at all. And so this might be a little bit of a naive question, but you mentioned, key pieces that you felt were missing from the exhibition, the one from the Venice Biennale and these smaller works that you referenced. Why do you think they weren't included? Do you think that was a choice of the curator, or were they just not able to get them?
Well, there are a number of issues involved here, and one of them was that the curators, Hetty Perkins and Kelli Cole, did not have any personal experience of Emily. Kelli claims to have seen Emily when she was 16, out in country, but Kelli wasn't a curator and didn't have any sense of it. Apart from that, so they didn't really have anybody involved who knew Emily or had even seen or remembered some of these big exhibitions. Neither of the curators had seen the shows in Japan, for instance, which are absolutely crucial. When it came down to doing a show, they wanted to do a different show because the previous show was 20 years ago. They wanted to do something different. But unfortunately, their idea of doing something different meant to exclude, quite deliberately, all of the people who were involved in the previous shows and who knew a lot more about the topic. Someone like Margot, the Tate originally approached Margot O'Neill and asked her about this show. And she said, no, I can't do it, or I'm not doing another Emily. Why don't you talk to the National Gallery of Australia? So they did talk to the National Gallery of Australia, with the result being that the National Gallery of Australia curators then proceeded to completely write Margot out of the picture. She didn't even get an invitation to the opening of the show in Canberra, although Hetty and Kelly swore that she did get one and perhaps it got lost in the mail. They also wrote out as much as they could Chris Hodges, who was the original dealer, who took paint and canvas to Emily with Rodney Gooch and showed all of her early work. It was another remarkable thing because Chris knew Emily very, very well. He spent, years, side by side with her about all sorts of things. Why would you leave these people out? Instead, they took as their expert knowledge Delan Davidson, who is a dealer who's making waves at the moment internationally, selling Aboriginal art.
Wait, sorry. The Lane is the gallery that is now associated with Pace in the selling.
Delarn had a show with Pace to coincide with the Emily exhibition at the Tate, yes.
Right.
And
Yeah. Okay.
but Delarn gets most of his Emilys from one source, which is Delmore Downs, which is the Holts. They have a controversial role to play in the Emily story, in as much as they were the property next door to Utopia, where Emily and the other artists lived. Emily would go there and work for the Holts and really churn out paintings. So of 30,000 paintings, probably 2/3 would have been done. I'm sorry, 3,000 to 30,000. Goodness, that's Sydney Nolan we're talking.
Just one question, a very quick answer. They're being discredited in the sense that they're being kind of ignored and set aside, or are they being discredited as not being original or fakes or whatever? I don't know. What's the reason?
It's totally ambiguous. It's scuttlebutt. It's basically implying that certain dealers are not honest, are not legitimate, that the works are somehow doubtful. But this is simply not true. I mean, there are a lot of works out there which are perfectly valid Emily's that simply were disqualified from being in the show. And the Tate, I believe, really should have done its own research and looked into these things if they wanted to do a first-class Emily show. What they got instead was they just took everything the National Gallery did, and the Tate, in fact, gave virtually nothing back. But when I was there on opening night and I looked around and it was Kangaroo Valley and wall-to-wall Australians, they were all white faces. There was nobody from Utopia, and I think that is an unforgivable omission, and it says a great deal about the thinking behind this show, or rather the neglect behind this show.
Well, thank you so much, John. This was really precious to have your perspective on things.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Well, I was just saying, I think I got a little peek into the underworld of politics.
Thank you, John. Bye-bye.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank you, Joanna.
John.
Thank you,
Take
Emily.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
How do you feel about all this? I think for me, it makes me think of outsider art and how you manage these collections and how you manage the production of these artists.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's like how you manage an artist is outside of my field of expertise. I couldn't, I mean, all I can talk about is the exhibition and how I felt about it, to be perfectly honest. And was talking about how the exhibition felt very flat. And I mean, to me, it was phenomenally exciting. It's like, this is my first introduction into her. And, I knew nothing about her before I went in. And I thought that, for me, as someone with novice perspective, going in and seeing the trajectory of her development, and just how much she changed and was obviously trying new things. I felt that throughout. I mean, I felt like there was propulsion through it. I mean, I think after you and I saw that video, which was maybe halfway through, maybe a little more than halfway through.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And we went into the second to last room. After we saw that video, I thought, oh, well, I've probably seen what she does. Like, she only did anything for 8 years. She only did painting for 8 years. We've probably seen the thing that she does, and this will be a continuation on from that. And it was just like, diving into a whole new pool. So it was interesting to hear his perspective, obviously from someone who has known the work for so long and has seen things that I have not seen, and experienced curation from someone who had such an intimate relationship with the artist, or a much more intimate relationship at the very least. But as he was talking about the flatness, I was just like, wow, I didn't experience that.
That's really true, I think. I mean, I agree with parts of what you're saying. I was really happy to see the exhibition. And then as you move on to the other room, there's these kind of atmospheric, almost textural and almost 3D impressions with incredible arrays of colors that she asked for, didn't use, then use others, according to Christopher Hodges that John was mentioning. She knew exactly what she wanted to do in the moment. And then you move on to the room where it kind of becomes again like those ramifications of white lines on black. And I felt I showed you, I had goosebumps
Yeah.
in front of a lot of paintings. So this discourse doesn't take away the fact that this is an incredible experience that you should not, prevent yourself from having, despite all the other politics that are important. And where I disagree with you is that progression I find really sterile. So in some ways I found the show really flattening things in this chronological order and then reserving that impact at the end, where I think the works were so impactful all the way through. And it kind of created an artificial highlight that really corresponds to a modernist idea of painting. I think what I would say is just spend time with the paintings that talk to you and just stay there. And I'm definitely going to go back. It's beautiful.
And I'm going to go back. I mean, he was talking about the batiks and how they were selling the batiks from all the women who were making them. And obviously hers had a real presence that drew people in. And, certainly with her paintings as well. It's like, I mean, while there may be different decisions that could have been made or different considerations made in the curation, it is still rooms full of these, incredible works that I'm definitely going to go again. And
yeah, me too.
And I've told Peter, you have to go, because he was like, well, you've already been, so maybe I won't go. And I was like, you have to go because I'm going again as well. So yeah, so I loved it. Yeah, goosebumps. For sure.
Yeah, me too. Was really exceptional. And there's another element as well, which you hear the voices of the group of women singing the paintings as well at a certain point in the exhibition. And that is also really magical. It's not done in the best way, I find, but the pleasure of actually having the opportunity to listen, even in an artificial setting, I think you also have your own critical sense. And I fight for this idea of you being empowered by your own experience of the works.
And it was so nice going with you. That was
So nice
really
going with you.
nice. I loved that. Wagamama and a Tate show with Joana. I mean, that's a good lineup. That's a very good lineup. So grab a friend and go see a show.
And if Wagamama wants to sponsor us, we're here, and we can always try to find the nearest Wagamama in museums in London.
I love the hustle, Joana. Cool.
Thank you so much, Emily. This was a pleasure, as ever. Thank you.
All right.
Take good care of yourself.
Take care.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Exhibitionistas is an independent podcast created and hosted by me, Joana Piar-Neves. We have episodes every 2 weeks, and this season 3, is a bit of a turning point. We have 5 new episode types, from more experimental art travelogues or art stories to conversational formats about solo exhibitions with people who are not part of the industry, because we're all both actors and spectators of art and life. If you're new here, you have a whole catalogue of episodes to enjoy. Discover them at your own pace.